we go back a few years and we know the history of Uganda, and maybe most of us here don't go back beyond a certain age, and we've read about the history of the early years of the last century, etc. Now, that's all very well. Ladies and gentlemen, I am inviting you to consider that history from the point of view of a country, our country, which was actually concocted together. This has been touched on by my predecessor, and I'd like to say a little bit more about it as well. Ladies and gentlemen, the concept of Uganda, what we call Uganda, the borders of Uganda were actually determined here in Europe at the Berlin Conference in 1884. The European powers at the time wanted to avoid a war over Africa. There had been a scramble for Africa, where they had suddenly discovered that Africa was the new frontier, where they could get markets, where they could get resources, etc. So there was a scramble, and the rulers of Germany, I think it was von Bismarck, Chancellor von Bismarck, invited these European powers to get together and see how they can divide up Africa. To them, Africa was that land of the very hot sun, of great resources, of people who all have the same color, probably all think the same way, certainly not as superior as they were, and that's how they viewed Africa. Now, obviously we know better. When they went to Uganda, I'll focus my attention on Uganda, they actually carved out a territory. Some parts of it may have been changed by now, but that sphere of influence, which was handed to Britain, was carved out purely in the interests of the colonialists. They did not bear in mind the intense differences of the people within that territory. We know we are so different. Our languages, our political systems, our culture, our dress, all sorts of things. That was not important to them. So, ever since the colonialists took over, they have tried to rule Uganda. They did try to rule Uganda as one monolithic, homogeneous entity. Now that has never worked. And as I deliver the historical perspective, I want you to take note of the tensions and conflicts that have arisen as a direct result of a system that was imposed upon a people who did not participate, who did not go, who did not, if you like, fuse naturally. Now, without wasting too much time, I'll briefly talk about the colonization. I've talked about the colonization of Uganda, Uganda's boundaries. Uganda came under the British sphere of influence. Beg pardon. The natives obviously had no say in the merging of the country. And as I said, the decisions were based solely on the interests of the European powers, and heterogeneity was suppressed as tribes were ruled as one monolithic entity, which is what we've just said. Now, many mistakes were made, as they still continue to be made today. The British assisted Buganda in seizing territory from Bunyoro. Buganda and Bunyoro were fighting. They were competing empires, as we all know. The British took the side of Buganda, and territory from Bunyoro was seized. Now this is a people you are planning to rule as one country. You're pitting one against the other. We all know the tactics of divide and rule. Is that what Uganda needed? Did they care? No, they didn't. What they cared about was how best it would suit their interests. That was the first big mistake. The Buganda Agreement, as my colleague said, Mr. Kim, established a cozy relationship, or he referred to it. It established a very cozy relationship between Buganda or Buganda government and the colonial powers, on the basis of which the British colonialists sent Buganda agents to colonize, to administer their rule, to establish their rule over the rest of the country. I can tell you, Buganda agents were not very popular. They suffered, or they experienced, or they demonstrated cultural chauvinism. They insisted on using their language. They did not mingle or integrate. They considered themselves superior. This was some kind of sub-imperialistic approach it did not make Baganda, it did not endear other tribes to the Baganda for obvious natural reasons. Now, that did not help, and the seeds for that actually went on and on, culminating into undesirable outcomes for both Baganda and the rest of Uganda. In addition to that, the Buganda Agreement of 1900 actually became the model for other territories to be acquired, for other treaties that were signed between Britain and other tribes of Uganda. Now, was that ideal? The way Buganda was organized, the way the monarchy, the feudal system, the land tenureship, everything else was specifically Chiganda, if you like. Acholi region, Ankole, Mbale, Bunyoro, they had different ways of looking at things. The colonialists did not care. They simply looked at this and said, well, it worked for Uganda, we'll establish it elsewhere. It didn't work exactly as they had hoped. But I'm saying these were the seeds of discord that were sown by this kind of forced coming together. Economic development became concentrated in the central region. Economic imbalance comes in. This is the result of poor administration. This is the result of administering a territory with the interests of the colonialists overriding the interests of the natives. Unbalanced development, where the central region, if you like the Buganda region, or Kampala, became the favored region. To this day, that's where everything happened. Rural areas, upcountry regions were largely ignored. Education, the best systems, hospitals, best infrastructure was in the center. We say that is wrong. It should not have happened like that if the natives had participated in this. The British continued with their tactics of divide and rule. The civil service was peopled mainly by Baganda. The Baganda were given a superior type of education to everyone else. The army was mainly peopled by the northern tribes. This was all very well designed. It was not accidental. It was designed to rule us, whereas at the same time splitting us. That did not work, and that was the result of a unitary system. Basically, fast forward to 1953, Uganda was ruled, up until 1953, Uganda was ruled as a confederation of states, each one more or less following its own traditions and cultures, etc. There was no move to fuse us together or to encourage us to fuse together. No, that did not suit the colonialists. The Baganda, obviously, by the 1950s, had been given, according to a superior position, which they sought to protect. Now, in 1953, the colonial administrators decided they wanted all their territories in East Africa to be fused into one East African Federation. Baganda did not like this at all, because they felt that they would be swallowed up. They felt that the white settlers would take their land, just like they had done in Kenya and then Rhodesia. So the Kabaka absolutely refused this. This caused conflict between the Kabaka's government and the colonialists, and the Kabaka was exiled. His first exile in London, Kabaka Mutesa, was exiled in 1953. The Baganda put up strong resistance, and finally, Kabaka Mutesa returned triumphantly. The governor, Sir Andrew Cohen, was recalled, and the East African Federation was resisted. Now, from then on, Baganda and other Ugandans actually started calling for independence from the colonialists. And from there on, political parties, political persuasions began forming, and these were formed and encouraged to be formed along sectarian lines, mainly tribalistic. DP came in, which championed the grievances of the Catholic. So again, Uganda was developing and being secretly, if you like, tacitly assisted to develop as a united but deeply divided state. That's what we had, and that was administered centrally. That was not good for us at all. So, fast forward to 1961, the Lancaster Conference, which enabled Uganda to draw up the first constitution, accorded Buganda, Toro, Ankole, and Bunyoro, and created the Kingdom of Busoga, which had previously consisted of principalities. The kingdoms were given semi-federal status. The rest of the country were ruled as districts, which included all our districts.